Thank you a ton, Michael, for spending some time with me this afternoon. I'm really excited to welcome you as part of the first class to the Athens Music Walk of Fame, along with Pylon and the B-52s and Neil Patman and Vic Chesnutt and the Elephant Six Collective and so many other great local artists. We really appreciate all the work that you've given. I think especially right now, I know I'm so happy that the work that you've done exists and the work that other artists have done is in the world, because I think it's what a lot of people are hanging on to. So I appreciate that dearly. I want to begin, Michael, just asking you about your initial impressions of Athens. So I think you were still a teenager when you arrived, and I worked with folks in their late teens and early 20s for a long time. And I think about just what a wild time that is in human experience. You're figuring yourself out, you're figuring the world out, you're figuring out, what am I about? How do I project myself? How did all that fit into Athens? And what did you think of this small southern town when you landed here?
I was not delighted by Athens initially. I came from a much more urban area outside of East St. Louis, where I went to high school. My father retired from the military, and he and my mother moved to Athens because my uncle, my mother's brother, had gone to college here and was involved in the civil rights movement on campus. And Athens, being in Georgia, was close to where my grandparents, my surviving grandparents, were living and had retired. And so my mother and father wanted to be near them. So they floated, a carrot for us to come. And I said, no, I'm going to stay here. I was living with a punk rock band. This is 1978, I guess. I was living with a punk rock band in a place called Granite City, outside of East St. Louis. We had no money. We ate spaghetti with butter. We cut each other's hair. We all had terrible haircuts and made terrible music. But for me, it was this. I was living like the punk rock dream or some idea of it, right? I'd never been at that point to New York or Los Angeles or London, any of the centers of punk rock, and so. When I ran out of money and became quite desperate, I came to Athens, and it just felt like a cow town. To me, it was really slow. I didn't know a single person here. The only thing I knew about it seemed very kind of granola hippie, beige, super slow, just nothing happening. And so
I remember the 70s being all beige.
Yeah. I mean, there was a restaurant downtown that I know Jim Herbert and a lot of people from the art school would eat at, and they were famous for every single item on the plate that they served for lunch being beige. Everything you could eat there was just beige. And so anyway, I was not very thrilled with Athens, and I wasn't thrilled with it for the first year or so that I lived here. But then, of course, I stumbled into the DeFi girls, which were Linda Hopper and Sandy Lee Phipps and Carol Levy, and a gang of kind of nascent, I guess might be the word, punk rockers who were forging their own path. And I fell into that group of people and realized that there was a scene happening in Athens. That's around the time I first met Jeremy Ayers. And
rest in peace.
Yeah, God bless him, and his influence on all of this, myself certainly. But so I wasn't thrilled with Athens, but I actually, when I found that group of people, I felt like I had
your people.
Yeah, I had a community suddenly, and it was a community that I was younger than everyone pretty much, but I was happy to be the young punk rocker that fell into that group. And that was, I guess, right around the time that the B-52s put out their first album, and Pylon were starting, and the Method Actors were starting, and maybe the Side Effects, I'm not sure. But it was an exciting moment. There were maybe 50 people in the whole scene at that point, but it was exciting.
Yeah, the scale is one of the things that has always struck me about Athens relative to other places that have become known as a scene. I mean, I think I don't know if you're in Haight-Ashbury in 1968 or if you're on the Bowery in 1978, if you take a 90-minute walk from either of those places, you're just in more urban fabric. I mean, from the Bowery, I mean, if I'm really hoofing it, maybe I get to Harlem or Brooklyn in 90 minutes. If you take a 90-minute walk straight in a line out of Athens up North Avenue and Nowhere Road, there are more cattle than people. Having been obviously in a lot of other scenes around the globe, how do you reflect now on the sort of tightness of the Athens artistic scene that was really emergent there in the late 70s and early 80s?
The B-52s really laid the template for what Athens could become, and because there were no bars that any of us were comfortable going to. I was too young anyway, but because there were no bars, because there were no places to hang out, there were no restaurants that anyone could afford. There was nothing to do. There were house parties, and so people would gather at each other's houses and drink and flirt and pair off and go have sex and start bands and write songs and then break up and then continue writing songs or start a new band. And that's kind of the way it went, It became.
And the first r.e.m. gig was famously at one of those house parties.
Exactly, yeah. It was a birthday party for Kathleen O'Brien, and at the old church there. What a dump that place was! My God, it's remarkable that it didn't fall on our heads.
So were people just like living in the auditorium space?
The front of the church had been divided up into an apartment. But if you crawled through a closet in one of the back bedrooms on the ground floor, I lived upstairs. Peter Buck lived across the hall from me. Bill Berry lived downstairs. You could go into Bill's room. You could go into his closet, get down on your hands and knees, and you could crawl through a hole, literally a hole in the side of the closet, and it would open up into the back of the church. And there was the remains of the pulpit and the stage where, which was the front of the church.
But like a punk rock Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was nuts, and I don't know how many people that night came through that hole in that closet. A couple people. I know that at some point I had stilts, and you could get up through the window in the back of the church from the stilts, but most of those people crawled through that. It was a total fire trap. It was just unbelievable that. And apparently there were bodies buried underneath the floor. I mean, the whole thing was really pretty tawdry, but it was perfect for that moment. It was perfect for r.e.m. It was perfect for our introduction to and everybody was supportive. Everybody became really excited that there was a new group to go kind of get excited about, and so there we were.
One of the things I've always loved about Athens' musical scene relative to some others is that so when I arrived in the mid-'90s, came for graduate school, it didn't seem provincial here. It seemed like everybody was into everybody else's thing, whether somebody played folk music or somebody else did freak out stuff, or there was, the kind of widespread hippie jam band scene. It seemed like everybody wanted to listen to everybody else's stuff. And that always impressed me about Athens.
Yeah, there was always, I've found, anyway, having been based here for 40 years, I've found that people are incredibly supportive, not just of music, but of all the different mediums, all the ways that people create and throw it out into the community. Athens has always been very, very supportive of that. It also, I said earlier that the B-52s were the template. Well, they were for our generation, but there was a rich history in Athens as a university town of exactly the kind of thing that my uncle, as a college student, was involved in the civil rights movement. He then went on to become involved in Disability Act, which the genesis for the national rollout of that was in Georgia, to my understanding. And so there was an activism, there was a rich hippie culture, there was a rich, I think, gay culture here that the B-52s kind of came through that, and and culture of protest. And Athens is, as we all know, a bit of a liberal island in what the face of it, and I don't quite believe this, I never really have, but on the face of it is a somewhat not liberal state. I actually think a lot of people
we're hoping to turn that.
Say what?
We're hoping to turn that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of gerrymandering. It's actually the last substantive conversation I had with Bill Clinton. We were talking about gerrymandering in Georgia, and I said it's the worst in the nation, and it has been for decades. And he said, "You're absolutely correct." And you're the first person who's not a political analyst to ever say that to me. But Georgia is insanely divided up and gerrymandered, and that's why it's been a red state for as long as it has.
Well, I think about this as somebody who taught Georgia history to eighth graders for a while. I mean, the way that you perceive time when you're 20 or 30 is differently than the way that, at 50, I perceive time. There's this sort of weird compression and sort of accordion style thing that happens. And, preparing for this conversation, it occurred to me that it was less than 10 years between the time that high schools integrated in Athens and the time r.e.m. began.
Wow.
And, and I wonder, for you to reflect on that time, were you conscious that even though we've got this very supportive scene, that, the broader outlying area, might not be queer friendly, distinctly isn't Black friendly?
I did not. That's an insane. I didn't realize that it was that close to my coming here, that the schools were integrated. That's wild. It's so funny because actually, going back to an earlier point, that when I first met Jeremy Ayers, he was at the Dunkin' Donuts there at the corner of
Village,
Prince Avenue and Village, right? It was open 24 hours, so it was one of the places you could go if you were a night owl. So I worked at a really, really crappy steak restaurant. And my friends, I didn't have many friends at that point, but my friends were the guys that worked in the back kitchen. I was a cook up front, and they were both Black, and they were both bodybuilders actually, so they were really jacked. And we would go out and hang out after work. Well, I was flanked by these two insanely beautiful.
Michael's already got security, and he's still working in the steak restaurant.
They were boxers. They had these incredibly beautiful smiles and really like jacked bodies. And that's when Jeremy first saw me. That's what I look like. He was like, "Who are those people? I want to know them." And that's part of how I kind of integrated into the punk rock scene, as it were. Which, actually, to be completely honest and frank about it, was always quite white. Even here, it was predominantly young white people that were interested in that part of the music scene.
And it does seem it really has been maybe the last 10, 15 years that the local hip hop scene has become more fertile. World Famous, when we could gather in indoor spaces, World Famous was doing regular hip hop nights that were great. I would sometimes get out of a meeting here in City Hall and head over there to listen to what was happening. So much talent here right now. It's amazing.
It had to happen, and it had to happen here. I've always maintained that the musical form that followed punk rock, and punk rock became new wave and no wave and all and became much more kind of mainstream. But the musical form that followed punk rock and had that same outsider and really like shockingly like bringing things in from places that people did not recognize and did not know personally was, of course, rap and hip hop, mostly coming out of New York in the very beginning. But those were two scenes that were completely integrated and taking notes from each other through disco. I think disco was definitely a part of the bridge between punk and rap and then of course hip hop.
Yeah, and I love thinking about those musicians that seem like they're at the crossroads, where they, equally had a disco element and then this sort of punk rock influence or those kind of krautrock groups.
I'm so excited about where all of that has come after these 40 years, these 30 or 40 years. to this post hip hop thing, which is really production driven and really about sampling. But it has brought through people like Q-Tip and Tribe Called Quest has brought who introduced Joni Mitchell to New York hip hop. People were like, "What? Excuse me? It's James Brown." And he's like, "No. Check this out. Check out the hissing of summer lawns."
Yeah,
and
a great record.
And so, from a production perspective, we wind up now with Billie Eilish on the one hand and Beyonce on the other. Production wise, not that different, and definitely post. It's come out of punk rock. It came through rap into hip hop, and now we're in this kind of post hip hop pop thing that's truly for me exciting. And we're including Justin Bieber and Arca. If you want to be that disparate, and Childish Gambino. These are all coming from this place that really was brought together by in the 70s punk rock and in the 80s hip hop.
Yeah, I mean, for a guy who in the 80s worked in record stores, I have a little bit of sadness about just the sort of dissolution of the old school distribution network and the physicality of holding a record. But the flip side of that is that, like, anybody who can get a laptop can make a record at home. And so you've got Billie Eilish and her brother doing that.
And did you just say flip side?
There you go. There you go. Yes. No, I still remember stocking the 45s in the record bar. So,
well, that's where Elephant Six came to me. I was, they were a generation below me. I don't know the actual age difference, but I'm going to guess around 14 or 15 years. And watching them come up and watching what they were doing and watching how the different groups of people were all playing together and interlocking and forming these new alliances and new things, and sitting literally in their kitchen and watching them work. It was completely that Billie Eilish and her brother kind of thing that you're talking about. It was the ability to record onto a laptop, if not a laptop, a cassette player, a cassette recorder, a DAT machine, whatever it was at that moment. And that's where Elephant Six came out of. That's where Vic Chesnutt came out of, and it provided Athens and then much later the world with this whole new way of looking at the legacy of Athens, Georgia, the legacy of the music and how that's passed down from generation to generation, how it's continued.
Michael, you mentioned Vic Chesnutt, who's somebody whose songs I just have great affection for. I mean, really up until the last records he was doing with Guy from Fugazi and that crew. Could you talk a little bit about encountering his work for the first time and then working with him in the studio?
Yeah, it's so wild that he and Guy wound up working together because I knew all those guys. I knew Ian from Minor Threat back in the and the incredible scene that was coming up, the rap scene that was coming up in Washington, D.C., and then Minor Threat and Ian and Discord Records were kind of, and then the whole, what's it called, where you don't drink and you don't...
straight edge.
Yeah, the straight edge thing came through Ian, which is so crazy. But Ian, of course, went on to form Fugazi, and then we were friends. Crazy to me that, excuse me, through Jim Cohen, I think it was. I brought Jim to Athens for the first time. He met Benjamin Smoke from Opal Fox Quartet. He met Vic, and then brought and Jim had made films about both of those, both Vic and about Benjamin. And then which was Athens scene, but really had kind of a very much Atlanta scene, but it had a very Athens kind of vibe to him and to everything that he ever worked with. So we can kind of claim him a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad to.
Through Jim, Vic met Guy, and because Jim also made a film about Fugazi. So it was all coming through this filmmaker from Brooklyn who came to Athens as a fan of r.e.m. and we started working together and became very, very dear friends. And then all this stuff came together. So yeah, Vic, I mean, when I first met him, I was astounded. There's no other word for it, by the level of songmanship, the lyrics that was pouring out of that kid were unbelievable. I still call him a kid. I think we're not that far apart in age, but he was really he was such a bratty little pissant, and yet when he got on stage and opened his mouth and started playing, it was just mind blowing. And he was doing these. I want to say it was Thursday night at the 40 Watt Club. It was when it was there on Clayton Street.
The Clayton Street.
And what was the 1111 club that Rick the Printer owned, and it was the first place R.e.m. ever played after the church, and it got shut down by the cops. And we're still looking for. They took photos. We're still trying to find the photos. I don't know that we ever will, but Vic came off stage, and I did walk up to him and I said, "We've got to get you in the studio before you kill yourself." And that's the first thing I ever said to him. And we went in the studio. We went into John Keane, and he recorded 21 songs in one night. And I ordered pizza. The extent of my producerial was ordering a pizza and keeping him going. And he recorded 21 songs that became Little. And then when the time came, I think I had taken a break from live performance. R.e.m. were on a bit of a hiatus in the early 90s. And I was spending a good bit of time in Athens. And that's when we made West of Rome, which later, Hal Wilner, the great, we've recently
sadly passed away.
It's 1730.
It's 1730. We recently lost Hal to COVID-19. He was the first death in my close circle of people to have been lost in this pandemic. But Hal is to me one of the greatest producers and musicologists, one of the greatest lovers of music I've ever met or encountered. And when Hal sat me down one night some 15 or 20 years ago and bought me a drink and said, "I want to tell you that West of Rome is the best produced album I've ever heard." And I was like, you cannot. I was thrilled with the work that I was able to do with Vic and that record. I was thrilled to identify as being Athens based and to be able to speak about to anyone who would listen to be able to speak about Vic and the work that he did as a singer-songwriter. To have Hal Wilner tell me that West of Rome was the best, he said it was the best produced record he'd ever heard. My God,
That's beautiful.
I think it remains the greatest compliment I've ever been paid in my life.
Well, and some have said that, producing is setting the scene. If you put somebody at ease, you set them up in a room and it gives them the opportunity, it gives them the space. I mean, there's a lot to be said, I think, for that piece of music work.
I think I challenged Vic as a producer, and in doing so, allowed him to question some of his own, to trust his instinct, but to question some of the choices that he had made, whether lyrically or in terms of arrangement. And then the material for that record, I was a big proponent in helping to decide what songs would be featured on it. But my God, what an insane, immense talent. I mean, I really put Vic up there with Leonard Cohen and Dolly Parton and Jimmy. I think he's a brilliant and wildly underrated American songwriter.
I was always really shy if I encountered him and kind of in awe of him. And the one conversation we ever had was in front of the Long John Silver's Captain D, excuse me. I'm confusing my crappy fast food on Prince Avenue, and his wheel, the rubber wheel on his chair, had come off the axle, and so he was sort of stuck, and so I stopped and I fixed his wheel, and just said, hope you have a good night. It was getting close to dusk, so I was a little worried because he's there in the drive-thru essentially. And I walked away just floating. I was like, oh my God, I just had a conversation with Vic Chesnutt, as if it's a pinnacle experience.
He had that demeanor, he had that way of making people not want to approach him. And of course, he was incredibly warm and insanely smart, and such a wit. This incredible dark and very dry sense of humor. But once you kind of cracked that shell, he was really a sweetheart.
I loved the variety of his stage demeanor. I think at the very last show I saw of his with that, Fugazi, or with the Guy and Canadian guys group. I mean, he was howling like he was Robert Plant during some of those songs. I mean, just so overt. And then there were other times if he would play solo or just with like really minimal accompaniment, it was almost like you were listening to somebody tell like dirty jokes on their front porch.
Yeah, I mean, he had that prankster element like Andy Kaufman, another hero of mine, which, from show to show, you never knew what you were going to get. You're going to get absolute genius, or you're going to get this kind of rambling. He was really like pushing buttons and trying to prank people and trying to make them angry, trying to get them upset.
He was good at it seemed.
But by the time he was doing those shows with Guy, my God, I mean, they're actually Jim Cohen made some films of some living room gigs that those guys did together. It's some of the best stuff that I've seen of Vic's work.
Yeah, I've got a recording of that last 40-watt show of his that's just incredible. I'll send you a link to it. It's marvelous. I just want to ask a couple more questions, Michael. So, you mentioned the kind of the art influence and the visual influence on the Athens musical scene. I mean, that always has been striking to me as well. And you, of course, have done so much different work, internationally well known for the musical work. Been an art teacher, internationally exhibited now, a lot of great books of your work. Do you see a through line that you picked up early in your Athens experience that's carried on?
Absolutely. I think Athens, I know. Athens made it okay for one to become exactly who one is and to encourage not eccentricities, but to allow people to be who they are. And I certainly found that through, and again, back to Jeremy, but through the B-52s, there was a beautiful, for me, my community before Athens and before finding the punk rock scene here was much queerer. And so to be able to find that here and to feel comfortable within that and to feel like, okay, I can be exactly who I am and not really worry about it so much, and actually allow that expression to come through the work that I'm doing, and in very subtle ways at times, but it was always there. I mean, and going back to that, I'd love to just shout out to the B-52s. I know there are several projects going on right now. I think a documentary film and a couple of books that I've had the pleasure to talk to and talk about the influence of the B-52s, because they have not gotten the due that they radically changed American music, and for the better. When they went to New York for the first time, no one had ever heard anything like that. No one had ever seen anything like that. It was actually radical, and it remains. If you look back, it remains absolutely radical. And the way that the music, the way that the music came together, the way that Ricky Wilson played guitar alone, that alone is it's like Harry Parch. I mean, it's like insane experimental Arvo Part level nutso, and it worked, and it completely, I think, blew a hole through what was fast becoming this kind of like, this is what you have to look like, this is what you have to sound like, this is what you have to talk like, this is how you present yourself. It had become this very kind of not interesting thing, and they just blew all this these fresh ideas into it. And I
know even contemporary with their arrival in New York, Yoko Ono and John Lennon would speak about just how much they loved that record, and found it resonant.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, is there anything else you'd like to say to folks here in Athens as we celebrate 40 years of your work being out in the world?
I mean, I'm really thrilled that r.e.m is in that canon of people that you named at the very beginning, and I'm very honored and humbled to be a part of that in any possible way. But I would say to Athens, and this is a particularly difficult time for everyone, I think, but the creativity here allowed me, the scene and the creativity allowed me to become, I think, the best version of myself that I could become, and allowed me also the space to grow within that, to make mistakes, to fall on my face, to do things my way. There it is.
And that's the best all of us can hope for, is to be constantly becoming that better version of ourselves.
I didn't become someone else's idea of what I should be. I became who I am, and then with the support of the band, we were able to take that to a larger and larger and larger and much larger audience. And so it changed my life, certainly. And I don't think without the influence of Athens, without the support that I felt here very strongly throughout, I don't feel like I would have ever been allowed to become the person that I became. And I say that with no false humility. I like who I am. I like the influence I've had, but I owe a great deal of that to Athens, Georgia. And so thank you and kudos, and continue.
Well, Athens loves you back. I can say that if not for your work and the scene you were part of, I wouldn't be here. So thank you for all you've given, and best wishes on the road ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, great to see you, Mayor. Take care.
Yeah, good seeing you, Michael. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.